Hello. Hola. Hola. Sí, perdón. Ahora sí. Hello, hello. Good morning. Bueno, estamos aquí todavía. We are going to start now the second session of this seminar, which will be devoted to the economic aspect of an inclusive and open international order. We have for this panel to discuss with us Professor Yukari Akeda, who is right now an academic visitor at Oxford University. She's a teacher of international relations at Rikyo Law School in Tokyo and has been till July last year the Deputy Director of the International Economic Division of MOFA and very much into the negotiations of the European Union-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement that, as you know, has been recently finalized. She's an expert on EU trade, legislation and governance, the globalization model of the European Union, and has written several articles and publications on EU trade norms and their impact on managing globalization and social stability. We also have Professor Itoh, Motoshige Itoh. He's a professor at Gakushuin University and also a counselor in several capacities of Prime Minister Abe. Has served as dean at the Graduate School of Economics at the Faculty of Economics of the University of Tokyo, where he's a teacher also. He's specialized in international economics, Japanese economy, economic policies, and industrial economics. And he has been, I believe, one of the disseminators of Abenomics in his capacity as a counselor of Prime Minister Abe. And also advocated, I think, on this new Japanese FTA-oriented trade policy that we are seeing these days. He has written over 40 books and on different policy issues and regularly collaborates with newspapers and specialized publications. We also have with us Félix Arteaga, is a principal researcher of Elcano Institute, as you know, and professor of the Institute Gutiérrez Mellado, specialized in international security issues at UNED, la Universidad a Distancia. Here in Spain, he's an expert on international security, international defense issues, national security, international operations and management of international crises. Also responsible for many publications and also advises regularly Spain's security and defense policies. Finally, we have with us Annamaria Goyamamoto. She's a doctor in economy and business administration at the Universidad Autónoma in Madrid, a specialist in practice of consumption, sociology, theory, and practice of market research. She teaches now at Universidad Autónoma and has been or is visitor teacher at Instituto de Empresa, also Universidad de Andalucía, being an expert of consumption and lifestyles in Eastern Asia. So this session is going to be devoted to the title of the session, Joining Efforts in the Maintenance of an Open and Inclusive Economic Order. All the participants of this panel have been in various capacities in their governments or in academia tackling these issues. We will have, let's say, two points of view. Professors Akeda and Itoh, I think, are going to talk more about the importance of the EU-Japan FTA, both for Japan and the European Union, and how this reinforces the open international order. And then we have Félix Arteaga and Annamaria Goyamamoto, who are going to address some of the collaterals of this agreement. Annamaria Goy, I think, is going to talk about the, let's say, the internal front of this kind of agreements. let's say, the fifth column of the liberal order, no? How the socioeconomic challenges in Europe, in particular, and Japan, that erode globalization consensus, and how Japan and the European Union can cope with this erosion. Félix Arteaga is going to tackle more the, let's say, the external front, how Japan and the European Union can devise a counter-narrative against the disinformation and the smear campaign against the liberal order that China and Russia could be launching right now. No? Before asking them to start with their presentations, which will take more or less 10 minutes, and then we will open a debate with you, I would like to launch a few ideas. No? One idea is that, when we are addressing this issue, is that we have two contradictory and highly unstable dynamics in place. On the one hand, there is the divide between public-oriented economic policies of countries such as Spain or Japan, and then there is the corporate economics, which actually skillfully play the loopholes of the system. On the other hand, we have also the contradiction between state-run economy becoming predominant, such as China, playing and winning with different rules, and then the liberal economies where social contracts are being constantly eroded. No? So I think these are both phenomena that have to be considered and have been considered in the European Union Japan FTA to try to find a solution or an equilibrium at least. No? So I would like now to ask Mrs. Akeda to start with her presentation. And well, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here because I spent more than 9 hours last evening at Heathrow Airport. So finally, I'm here. And also, used to be a member of Japan delegation for EU-Japan EPA negotiations. I'm so pleased. Finally, we concluded this agreement, and unexpectedly, the result was very ambitious and robust one. Today, I'm talking about the implication of this EPA in reshaping or removing liberal economic order, partly based on my own experience. But this is my own opinion and not representing Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's nobody can deny the EU and Japan share the basic principles and values of liberal economic governance, and more importantly, we share the awareness of urgent issue to tackle, to deal with, to save current liberal order. However, during the negotiation, we recognized the both party has quite different approaches and also quite different priorities to the issues to tackle. For example, Japan's approach is very comparatively speaking, business-oriented. As you know, the primary objective or motivation of Japan to launch EU-Japan EPA in the first place is to recover our business disadvantage with Korea produced by the conclusion of EU-Korea FTA. And also, Abe recently declared to make Japanese economy, Japan as most business-friendly country. So our approach is very business-oriented. And also, our approach is very functional. We believe economic growth and producing more jobs and enhancing middle class would lead more awareness about environmental protection or human rights protection to issue global governance. And also, at the same time, our approach is very flexible. Our FTA templates can change according to our counterparts' economic development situation or political situation. On the contrary, EU approach is business and people-oriented. The European Union is take more seriously people's anxious concern about globalization and populism growing. And EU approach is famously very normative. And most importantly, EU approach was very, very consistent because of its constitutional mandate to exercise trade policy in line with democracy or human rights, other political and social values. So these difference leads also different priorities. Japan's priority is efficiency, improving economic efficiency through FTA. On the contrary, EU's priorities are not only economic efficiency, but enhance transparency in trade rules, and also promoting European values. So based on these differences, EU proposed many social agendas to include EU-Japan EPA, and many of them were quite new for Japan. But Japan and EU agree to explore this new dimension of FTA agreement. And the good example is Sustainable Development chapter. It is for Japan very first time to include this chapter into bilateral FTA. And also we include the chapter on corporate governance and also a chapter on transparency. And also geographic indications as part of intellectual property chapter. So finally, we conclude very ambitious and very a new kind of FTA. So does it mean from now on, EU and Japan can cooperate and more harmoniously promote these social dimension of globalization or not? My answer is yes, but this is yes, because these values and our common understanding is explicitly codified in the text of FTA agreement. That means these values are now a legal basis in Japan, and we are ready for implementation. that is a very positive aspect because for accepting these new chapters and new norms, Japanese side worked very, very hard to find out our legal basis, searching for our international agreement, domestic laws and regulation. And if we could not find any basis, we completed to ask Japanese Diet to reform our laws or produce new laws. So we already spent huge amount of transaction cost and adjustment cost to accept these norms. That means from now on, Japan can promote these norms as a template or chapters of FTA to other partners without paying extra transaction cost or adjustment cost, because we already adjusted and we already make sure we can implement. So this is the very yes side. But the bad side is this is still exogenous nature. It is not produced from the domestic pressure of Japan. It is introduced from the European Union. So someone say our acceptance is still very superficial, and it not be a kind of standard template for Japan's future FTA. But also, again, there are two yes elements. One is the competitive effect of these social norms and chapters. For example, the environmental protection is the best example. If we apply very high environmental protection standard and other trade partners don't follow, we are facing very competitive disadvantage. It's kind of social dumping. So for the Japan, now we have a motivation to promote these norms to the other world, including China. And second element is internalization. These norms, in the time being, going to be the social Japanese domestic social norms. It might be, it would be take time, but sometimes it's surprisingly very quick. For example, geographic indication. In the beginning, Japanese governments are very cautious to accept this idea because already many Japanese companies used some European brand. So it's an economic problem for Japan. But now Japanese government see it's a very good idea to promote Japanese brand and protect our brand. And also it's very good for local society. So this socialization process would proceed very quickly. So in these elements together, I think Japan still flexible and functional. But at the same time, the convergence about our priority and approach is developing steadily. So in the future, Japan and EU can use these different approaches complementary and strategically, not contradictory or competitive way. And it, I think, definitely contribute to reshape the rules and norms of liberal trade governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Akeda. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it was very interesting to see how the process of incorporation of elements in the negotiation transformed somehow the views you had in Japan while devising both your trade. Yes. I think it was very interesting. Thank you, Professor Akeda, because you showed to us how this process of negotiations transformed, on the one side, your approach to trade negotiations. You decided also to incorporate this in the new exercises of negotiation that you are going to take now in the future, and also that you incorporated somehow socially the benefits, the transformative benefits that this kind of agreement could bring also to Japanese society. Thank you very much. Now I will ask Professor Itoh to give us his take also about this issue, and how this FTA is going to project maybe a new model of, let's say, constructive globalization. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to provide a very big picture about the process of the international economic order. Probably you agree there are basically three important channels for the trade negotiation or trade policy. One is multilateral channel, WTO is the center. And second is what I call bilateral, but it not necessarily mean two countries. Small number of countries can agree on FTA, EPA, customs unions. And third, which may be also very important, unilateral actions. Without any negotiation, each country have an option to introduce their own trade policy. For example, the South Asian countries in the 1980s unilaterally liberalized their market in order to get the benefit of the trade for their growth. Well, Japan recently unilaterally liberalized the visa regulation so that we can just attract more tourists coming to Japan. So multilateral, the regional or bilateral and unilateral are very important. The important thing, there are many, many interactions among them. Do you know why the America, Canada, and Mexico decided to just start NAFTA? And there are many reasons, of course. But obviously, difficulty of negotiation of the Uruguay land just push the back of the United States to just speed up the process of the NAFTA negotiation, because the United States thought at that time got the former form of the WTO was not a very good place for them to just move ahead the negotiation. So they decided just new approach NAFTA in order to just get the benefit of the price. And just conclusion of NAFTA was also the very important reason why Uruguay land could be concluded, because there's a lot of the disagreement about the agriculture policy between the United States and Europe at that time. But because of the action of the United States for NAFTA, if Uruguay land is not concluded, that may not be very good for the country outside of North America. So that kind of interaction is very important. So when we're talking about the FTA, say between the United States, between Japan and the EU, or any other country, we have to think about just the importance of WTO. Now, you have to remember there are three functions for WTO. One is what I say, legislative actions. That means that is a place for negotiation, for further liberalization. That's one. Second, I call it administrations. The rule and agreement which was achieved in the past was very important role to just control, regulate the behavior. Now, it is against the rule of WTO to just unilaterally increase tariff, which can easily happen in 1930s when you had a trade war. But now it is against WTO rule to just increase the type. So that kind of the rule decided in the past was actually very important for the administration. And third is judicial role, the role of panel. Japan had a very bad experience in the 1980s and 90s for the trade negotiation with the United States. Can you imagine very small, tiny country, Japan, is negotiating very powerful United States, and we are actually, receiving pressure to do something. So we have to restrict export or expand import, which is very bad for the resource allocation. But fortunately, after the Uruguay round, the panel function of WTO was just strengthened. So whatever happened between the United States and Japan, we just ask WTO to give us a kind of a neutral opinion. So although WTO's function is weakening, but it still is very important to just regulate the behavior of the country. Okay. And similarly, I think the bilateral negotiation, or especially Japan-EU economic partnership agreement, is very important because it is provide a lot of legal the commitment to the behavior of each countries. And so in the lecture, in the presentation this morning, I just mentioned the negotiation of the free trade agreement has a very important pressure to the direction of the local policy. Our for example, Japanese agriculture policy has a lot of things to do with the negotiation. So in that respect, the increasing number of the EPA is very important, and not only for EPA itself, but also its influence on the formation of domestic policies. It applies not only for agriculture policies, it applies for government procurement, competition policies, or environment regulation, and labor management, and so on and so forth. And one more thing I want to say is, what is the target, long-run target of EPA, FTA? And here, importance is the concept of building block versus stumbling block. There are more than, I think, 200 to 300 FTAs, EPA in the world. So you have many, many small size EPA, FTA. So you have to think about what is just a result of this sequence of these many FTA in the future. And the most, I think, desirable picture is you can just building up more and more complicated, but more, comprehensive nexus of network of free trade. Eventually, you can have the very good status of the global trade regime. In that respect, what we call super regional FTA, such as Japan, EU, or TPP, or maybe RCEP, or maybe TTIP, is very important because it is very important step from very tiny, many FTA to more comprehensive one. I think you have ever heard the concept of the so-called spaghetti ball effect, originated by Jagdish Bhagwati, Professor Bhagwati, which means just, if you have a many small number of FTA, each FTA have its own rule of origins. Then when the company is trying to do some kind of business, covering many countries, they have to pick up many different rules to just organize the activity. And this is very bad. So we need some kind of rearrangement of scheme so that if we can have a bigger FTA covering many countries, and that may provide us better. So I think the Japan EU EPA is itself important not only for itself, but it's also for the future. Finally, let me just mention just the economic implication of EPA between Japan and the United States. When I was a student 50 years ago, or maybe 40 years ago, whichever, we had a lot of lectures provided by us professor about the customs union, European experience. Europe was the only exception, and it's a very important case of the liberalization inside of Europe. And there, what we learned is we just have a demand supply curve and try to calculate how tariff reduction providing economic welfare to the trading partners. And the result is not very good. We all know the amount of the gain provided by triangle of demand and supply side is very tiny. Important thing is this is only just small portion of the more larger possible gain from trade. So in these days, when the economists calculate how much, say, Spain gain from Japan, EU, EPA, or how much Japan can gain from Japan, EU, FTA, the most sophisticated economic model provide you much, much larger gain than what I learned 40 years ago at school. The reason is very simple, because gain is not static. Gain is dynamic. You don't have to just worry about only the effect of lower price. What is more important is what is the growth process or dynamic economic process is coming from the conclusion of EPA. And so gain is not very immediate. You have to be very patient to wait 5 years, 10 years, or maybe 15 years. But then the result is much, much, much larger, and it is continuing. Why? Because of many reasons. One, it is a lot of reallocation of resources in Europe after Japan, EU, FTA. Just very similar to what happened in North America. 20 years ago when NAFTA was concluded, everybody was very pessimistic. Everybody say just a game, maybe very small. But what happened is now different. There's a very large, dramatic change of industrial structure across the border of Mexico and Canada, and the trade and investment is increasing because that is actually changing industrial structure a lot. And when Japan is starting the series of the FTA, EPA with Asian countries, what happened is the Japanese firms is actually expanding a very complicated division of labor across the border, producing some parts in Thailand, some material in Vietnam, and assembling in China, or maybe in Taiwan, and so forth. The same thing is happening in North America. So when Japan-EU process is concluded, what happened is big Japanese companies start thinking very seriously what kind of reallocation of their activity in Europe. Some maybe in Spain, some in Poland, some in maybe Germany, and so forth. And that is exactly the integration of the economy. So I think we have to just examine very carefully what happened from now on. But at least I think this is a very important starting point for the both Japan and EU can just change from EPA by what I call the dynamic process of the economic integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Itoh. I think that you mentioned many interesting ideas. One of them, of course, the different layers of, WTO regime, bilateral and multilateral agreements, and then unilateral trade measures that states can use, no? And so you explained as well how has been the procedure in the world affairs in order to make the economic order more open. I would also highlight this last idea that you mentioned, the fact that EPA between the European Union and Japan is going to probably be transformative, in the sense that we are going to see a lot of relocalization, new investments, both in Japan and the United States, to extract, let's say, the best of this group of countries that have been joined through the EPA. It's interesting, I think, because when you, for Spain, I think, because when you see the trade and commercial, the commercial data that we have is something that we see lacking very often is a lot of intra-industrial trade. It's something that is growing, but certainly it's what makes an economic relationship very strong and lasting, and not, let's say, frail to world crisis or or difficulties that that could arise. No, so now I'm going to give the floor to Félix Arteaga, who is going to maybe talk to us, about this. But another side, about another side, more security-related of this economic world order that Japan and Spain want to put together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning to everyone. This panel is about the maintenance of an open and inclusive economic order. And normally, when we make reflections on the economic order, we always take for granted that the current economic order, in one or another way, will continue to be the standard, the normal economic order forever. And I think that from time to time, not only, but from time to time, it's worth thinking about the future normal, if there are going to be a new normal or not. Because along this panel and along the reflections on the future order in the United States, Europe, and Japan, we tried always to correct deviations of the old model. We tried to introduce changes to improve the economic order, and we are trying to buttress the old economic order. And I'm not sure, but I think it's worth considering if this is going to continue to be the normal for the economic order or not. We are all aware that we are entering into a new phase of the society. We are living the analogical society, and we are entering into the new digital society. We are all aware about the quantity and quality of the changes that the fourth industrial revolution, the digitalizations, the artificial intelligence, the big data, and so many disruptive technologies will bring to the economic model. But we are still believing that a few adjustments, new agreement, new regional institutions, more or less inclusive, with cope with the challenges of the old paradigm. And that is what we try to do in meetings like this. I understand that policymakers and practitioners feel more comfortable living under this old paradigm, the known normal, lo malo conocido. But as a think tanker, my responsibility is to ask myself and you about the unknown normal, lo bueno por conocer, as well. So my reflection, my contribution to this panel comes from my experience in the fields of security and defense, where I see that the old paradigm is changing regardless the defense policy, security policy, and defense strategy thinking. I witnessed the change of paradigm from old to new normal in the field of security and defense. In this field, most of the decisions are still taken looking backwards to the post-Cold War or even the Cold War paradigm. And that is something we will have to overcome for the future. And regardless, all political, economical, budgetary, social and technological indicators of change, we are still grasped to the old model. That was our normal, the normal we learn in the military academies, in the universities, and we grasp it because we feel more secure than trying to explore a new security and defense paradigm. And we, of course, we take decisions, we introduce measures, but they are more incremental, and incremental measures only delay the need for more deep and structural changes. And that is the kind of answers that new normals require. Just a couple of examples to explain structural changes in the old normal. In the past, decisions on security and defense were made in restricted circles of government, administration, diplomacy, or military armed forces, or industry. But now, the decision-making process is more open. In the agenda-setting process, intervene not only traditional and governmental actors, but also the civil society, public opinions. They intervene in order to influence priorities, policies, and as a result of this new normal in the decision-making, we have in the security and defense field the so-called securitization process, an open process, an inclusive, an open process by which priorities are designed together by old and new stakeholders. And all priorities leave the security and defense agenda of the government. Priorities come into. So that is the experience, one of the experience in the security and defense. And the other one is about the strategic culture. The strategic culture is made of the perception of the user force of the elites, those who have the responsibility of the security and defense policy, and public opinion, the newcomers to this new process of agenda setting. And in the past, the strategic culture of societies, of advanced societies, was easier to maintain because there was some coherence between elites and public opinions. But now, I insist, seen from an external perspective to the economy field, in the security and defense field, this is changing very quickly. And the coherence is disappearing not only between public opinion and leaders, but also among leaders themselves. And that makes defense and security policy unpredictable. And the implications of unpredictable national security culture will have a deep impact, is having a deep impact on the international security. Today, this gap between leaders, and population, between societies from one side of the Atlantic or the Pacific and the other is growing in the security field. Priorities, as Professor Akeda mentioned before, views, approaches are different, are increasing, and that is something that addresses to the existence of a new normal in the security field. If we have had within the security and defense field a securitization process, are going to cope with economization process? Are we going to introduce a change in the economic culture of the international society among the like-minded countries or not. And here I see, in my opinion, the key tool for leading the change, for transforming perceptions on the economy as well as in security and defense, is the strategic communication. This is a new tool for decision makers, for leaders, to lead advanced societies to the future, to the coming future, along the change of order from the old normal to the new normal. And again, within the security and defense field, we see how new strategic communication policies try to shape national and international perceptions so that societies, public opinion, allies and partners understand that we live into a new normal of security, which is more uncertain, more insecure, full of unknowns, with different risks and opportunities. And despite this evidence, European, Japanese, and like-minded states still continue on security and defense, I insist, with the old paradigm of strategic communication, trying to persuade public opinions that the normal behavior, the normal policies are still a solution to new problems. All this, just to conclude, if my beliefs, and only if, on security and defense can be translated to the economic order, then I think that the prerequisite for a new economic order or for a more open and inclusive order must be based on this strategic approach. A strategic approach, strategic intelligence, and intelligence-led policies are about accompanying, not riding, but accompanying changes in order to guide decisions, policy making, explain to our population what is going on, which is not very easy, by the way, because, as you know, populations, politicians, not to talk about academics, we are very reluctant to strategic thinking, to changing paradigms, to change mindset. And so, and I conclude here, the problem, the challenge for social scientists, for think tankers, how to fight that battle for the new economic or security order. How do we win the minds and hearts of the population? How do we construct new narratives in order to prevent the gap between ordinary citizens and the changing security and economic order? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Félix. I think that it was very interesting what we heard now. Of course, there is this change, again in several layers, economic change that our governments are trying to cope with. I think that Félix introduced very well the question: is this a change that we can more or less cope with some measures, or we are now facing a more structural change, a completely new economic model and social model that will come after it. Also, I think it was very interesting your reflection on how governments are fixing this situation with a kind of Frankenstein policy, Frankenstein-type policies, no, which unite old concepts and also new ideas, no, concepts coming from, let's say, the old guard, the old experiences, and then the new ideas. Is this going to be effective for this completely new scenario we are witnessing? I think it's a very interesting question. Also, Félix highlighted the unpredictability of policies because of the many differences that we have. First, the differences of view between our civil societies and sometimes governments, and then also between leaders. No, it's something that we can see probably very clearly in these days where we don't even have a clear, let's say, Western front in defining how globalization should proceed and how we should continue providing welfare to our societies. No. Also, I think it's very important, very interesting, the stress that you made on the need of reinforcing a strategic communication to, let's say, explain or to pass through the new policies, the guides that maybe the governments have to give to populations. And also, I took note, of course, of your last ideas, no? The, let's say, 4 basic points on how to build a new inclusive economic order together that should probably be based on a strategic approach with changes in policies that would guide this strategic approach, strategic decisions, and that should be, let's say, very clearly explained through this strategic communication. Well, thank you very much, Félix. I'm going now to give the floor to Annamaria Goy-Yamamoto, who is going also from her academic experience going to talk about this more social and, well, economic and social part of globalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Thank you very much to the chair for presenting me, and thank you as well to the Elcano Institute for having me here in such an overwhelming academic and professional panel that I have. My presentation will probably take more about some divergences and some challenges commonly faced by the European Union and Japan in this multilateral, maybe new paradigm arena of liberal order. So just let me first have a little background, and probably here Itoh Sensei knows much better about the nature of Prime Minister Abe, but we can probably see on his actions that, well, he has publicly, generally publicly, taken necessary actions in a very timely manner. And in the case that we are talking, in the dimension that we are talking today, that of economic freedom, he sent clear messages on his position and commitment regarding free trade, preserving liberal economic order as part of the economic policy for Japan. The examples of this are that the presentation or the TPP, for example, was ratified by the Diet the day before Trump's inauguration, and that was not just by chance. Also, the EU Economic Partnership Agreement and Strategic Partner Agreement were presented the day before the G20 meeting in Hamburg, just last July. Even more, actually, Prime Minister Abe, he got Tokyo to be the next G20 host city for the first time ever in 2019, which will be a very precious, platform where to keep preaching and practicing the good, old, or maybe renew ways of this open and inclusive economic order. Despite the difficulties of his own ground, as already Akeda Sensei, for example, has mentioned when he was dealing with the TPP and the EU Partnership Agreement, and also Itoh Sensei mentioned how it was affected by the so-lobbied agricultural sector, This bet on free trade has been an opportunity to revamp primary and secondary sectors, as well as modernize a very much needed and largely unproductive tertiary sector in Japan. So it will be learning from these new opportunities that will arise, and we can call really for Japan as a positive convulsion. In this slide, the EU, taking like the 28 economies more or less in this case, well, we have always UK a little bit out of tone. The EU and Japan are actually walking together on the same side with the same direction. They do share the same concerns that have arisen in global economies since the 1990s. The end of Cold War, the financial Big Bang, the emergence of China, and the ambivalent dynamics of the emerging markets and developing economies. The keys actually for a successful and incredibly diligent conclusion of both economic and strategic partnerships agreements were, on the one hand, that actually both the EU and Japan were two mature markets with similar protection structures, and on the other, the transparency of the negotiations, which I think is a key point in this, in the way the agreement was done. From the 2008 financial crisis, we have witnesses 8 years of basically uninterrupted global economic growth with moderate inflation. And with a projection from the World Bank of 3.1% growth this year, it seems that we are still on the good side of things, of the cycle. However, maybe this perspective may vary as there are some winds of change that Wall Street has just given us. Yes, yesterday, Dow Jones went down the 25,000 kind of mental strategic line. Maybe because of this possible increase of interest rates policy, the new head of the Federal Reserve, Joseph Powell, or maybe because the tax cuts of Trump has an effect on increasing really the real wages of the workers, something that sometimes investors don't like so much. The Japanese counterpart in the Bank of Japan, Mr. Kuroda, would probably seem to keep his position, and he will continue with his quantitative easy monetary policy, so far in search for that longer 2% of real inflation target that has not yet achieved in Japan. We have to say that in 2090, there's expected, I'm talking about real inflation, because in 2009, there will be an increase of the consumption tax that was programmed already and has been actually delayed because of the conditions of the economy of different questions. So, in fact, this is actually one of the aspects where Japan and the EU have not been walking with the same pace or even the same path. While Japan embraced Abenomics' 3-year program of easy money flow and heavy public spending, the EU was still dragged into the very cautious austerity that was present since the beginning of this decade. Other illustrations of these divergences can be found, for example, in the policies on cryptocurrencies, where in Japan they have been accepted and fostered, even with the very recent theft of CoinCheck, 524 millions of virtual coin NEM. While, for example, in Japan, they have been working eagerly on ways to control, basically, these cryptocurrencies, limit the transactions on them, especially concerning tax evasion, money laundering, and market volatility, by being very specific about what is called the KYC, the Know Your Customer information, that is to say, losing the anonymity that is currently owned by this transaction of cryptocurrencies, and embedded it in the blockchain process that is now kind of like the question of digital economy. The only exception will be in Europe, the case of Estonia, that where digital economy, let's say, is part of their new DNA, and they are trying to have cryptocurrencies as part of their economic growth policies. A third case is the Japanese embrace of the so-called sharing economy, especially in the tourist sector, where Airbnb will officially provide shelter to the many visitors of the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games that will bring to Japan. The public debate on the disruptive eclosion of these services has questioned local and national governments in the EU to find solutions and protect the abuse that these new services offer on the net have implied to the market, as well as to the precarious labor conditions of those who work in this type of environment, where a legal void has helped their expansion. So we see certain divergences. And let me just finish with another example in this case. Quite a hot issue with both economies. They are both actually looking now together to the personhood of robots. I'm talking not only about industrial robots, we'll have a height of expansion in 2019 predicted, but more about these android robots, humanoids, or etc., where liabilities, ethics, and incentives to protect the labor market are taken into consideration to formulate a chart of robots, where they will be given the status of electronic persons. In the EU, the vision of humanized robots provokes mixed feelings, in contrast with, more or less, let's say, the normality or amazement view that the Japanese have towards them. Just a few days ago, for example, the fifth Henna Hotel, like the strange hotel or the awkward hotel, if we can translate it in Japanese, is a robotized establishment that opened in Ginza, one of the main luxury avenue in Tokyo, if you have the chance to visit Tokyo. Well, 7 robots can handle the work of 30 people. You might consider this as an anecdote, but 98 companies in Japan are working on 15 devices by the year 2020 that will cover 80% of the necessities of elderly care in Japan, a market that has long been the subject to focused immigration policies. So now we can start talking about precisely the taking account these divergences in certain areas. We can talk about the challenges that the EU and Japan are going to face, even with these different points of views. They share these common challenges, and let's say it can be resumed in finding a path for a sustainable growth and productivity within a normative platform that might need to be changed or not. Just let me give you some few strokes. I decided to find words that start with S, just to make a little bit of a storytelling for myself. So the first 2 words are saturation and scarcity. Scarcity is the key word for economy. I mean, if we don't have a scarcity, we just don't have even start to talk about economy. And we are having aware of the challenges that both economies in global have gone through with different approaches in the macro policy perspective in different decades, but especially in the last one. But also we have actually, paradoxically, we have saturation. And saturation might either not be a good thing. In the last years especially, confronted after the financial crisis, we have seen increasing imbalances of wealth and the deterioration of the middle class, especially known in Europe. In Japan was a little bit earlier in the 1990s, but we have several same kind of experiences. Part of it is due to the saturation of players. We have now multiple players that not all of them follow completely the liberal order rules. They are trying to maybe teach them. And part of it is the saturation of the markets, whether it's goods, services, or opinions, public opinions. And these are highlighting the extremes precisely on these markets, favoring the search of what we can call misleading information or misleading realities. We have, for example, conspicuous, on one hand, conspicuous consumption, buy and throw, that contrasts with some policies that have been implemented by EU and Japan for a long time. The 3R policy, they were committed to that one, the reuse, recycle, and reduce policy, necessary to the sustainability of the planet. In fact, how already Akeda Sensei has mentioned before, the sustainability chapter is an incredible step ahead on shaping and taking initiative in a multilateral, well, maybe from the point of view of Itoh Sensei from a bilateral, but in a multilateral arena, the debate for environmental protection. In fact, Japan and EU have a rich history of multilateral environmental common ground, like the Argo Program Ocean or the Clean Waters or the Natural Resources Management, where they try to work on it. But maybe we should ask the EU and Japan to go a little bit further, to be pioneer in creating, for example, a normative content and not just a declaration of ethical issues or of will in the provision and consumption of items, for example, or services in this light. Another word is satisfaction. I'm referring to satisfaction as to the community that the governments have to serve, the satisfaction of their citizens, their populations, and as well the adjacent, the affected communities that they tackle with. How to sustain, for example, the welfare system? It has been a challenging question for the last decades. How to set, it was a norm, for example, to have a pension system where there's a generational solidarity. Can we actually keep that on? Another question will be, for example, the challenge of the youth unemployment, especially we know that case in Spain, but Japan also, although has a very low unemployment rate right now, it has precarious conditions for many of these youth workers that makes a good number of them as working poor, something that we also know that is happening in Europe and especially in Spain. And for example, as well, we can talk about the ethical, to try to pursue ethical and migration and asylum policies, which EU has been kind of like in the avant-garde, but Japan is still thinking about how to give a good answer to it, let's say in a way. It's also the satisfaction of the work-life balance and the gender equality policies. It's also the satisfaction of having safe and healthy and clean environment, for example. In this case, Japan was working a lot in development aid with China, precisely to avoid having toxic fumes over the sky, over the air. The satisfaction as well with effective and shared development aid policy, helping both parties to increase their geopolitical presence while setting ethical and standards and focusing on real issues that need to be solved. And third and fourth words will be safety and security. That previous panel has talked in a more defense type of dimension. Safety and security is also related to protection, which is also a word that we try to kind of avoid. But safety can be in many dimensions. For example, for Japan, it was important to have food safety and also food security, programs of food security that are part of the development aid programs. For example, as well, pandemic safety, where EU and Japan have collaborated intensely, and where, for example, in the field of biotechnology, it's quite important to have to set a normative on ethical and moral standards that will allow us to progress, but also protect the humans. Cyber terrorism, one of the key issues that has been in the EU-Japan agenda, although it hasn't been disclosed mostly, cybersecurity of big data losses or cloud hacking, or disaster crisis management, that being counterterrorist, conflict prevention, peace building, or natural disasters management. In fact, it is in the area of science, technology, and energy where Japan and EU have been collaborated the most in a multilateral setting. Now, probably, we will need to challenge the norms, the new norms that can go ahead with finding solutions for responsible development of artificial intelligence, a commitment on nuclear safeguards, and the exchange, for example, of information on very expensive technologies in order to kind of share these technologies, make them available, and the application of, for example, new materials into future products. So just to conclude, Japan and the European Union in these different economies have to try to focus and foresee the future with the same lens in order to be able to cope with these challenges and get smart and successful solutions that are cohesive, effective, non-overlapping, and efficient policies that include people's voices. That's quite a challenge. And there are some little examples of it, like, for example, the Open City platform that will conclude this year, which is the research project of like building 6 smart cities in Europe and Japan by contemplating people's voice and trying to create a new norm. Maybe this will be just one example of the steps that will be generated in the cooperation between EU and Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annamaria. Thank you very much. I think it was a very interesting intervention. We spoke on the transformations in our society and economy throughout this fourth industrial revolution that we are witnessing right now, and how this is affecting our socioeconomic model both in Japan and the European Union, with common challenges, as Annamaria explained, with the, let's say, words that she used, saturation and the scarcity, this breakup of somehow the social pact that we had after the Second World War, and well, that now we can witness now with the increasing differences, social differences in this last part of globalization. The fact that also within our economic models, both in Japan and Spain, we see that not everyone is using the same rules, so that adds to the rupture feeling that impregnates our societies. Also, she mentioned sustainability and all the challenges that it means right now, the possibility that Japan and Spain can act together to reintroduce some governance in this area. And also the importance of tackling satisfaction of our societies, how we have to take into account the ideas and the that we get from the civil societies, and finally the issues of safety and the security protection. Let's say, to use the concept of President Macron, l'Europe qui protège, something that comes very much now into the minds of political decision makers. So thank you very much to every panelist for the many interesting insights that we could see today. And we are going to have now some time for some questions. I open the floor now. If there is somebody in the audience that would like maybe to say something, please. If you could say before who you are and where are you coming from, that would be very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Gary Halpin. I live in Madrid. I'm retired, and I used to work for the union, the Universal Postal Union in Bern, Switzerland, which is a UN specialized agency. I was in senior management there. And my question relates to the comments that were made about decision-making and the input from civil society. And one example of that decision-making process, I believe, was the results that occurred under the British vote for Brexit and the successful decision to get out of the European Union. I learned some interesting statistics about the profile of the different voting segments. And the voting segment, 18-year-olds to 45-year-olds, who I would see as the the engine of the British economy, voted 78% to stay within the European Union. So civil society, in my opinion, made a mistake, whether they were not well informed or whether there was too much emotion in the process. But I think, I have to ask this as a question, but how can the future evolution of our society take into account the input from civil society, but as a valid input in order that the world order isn't completely destroyed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can take a second question, and then we will ask our panelists to give their take on these issues. Is there somebody else who would like to...
Fernando, if I may.
Yes, of
Thank
course.
Thank you very much. That was a very good point, by the way. And, you know, there was a competition in Twitter to see what was the best definition of Brexit in 5 words. And responding to this generational phenomenon that you mentioned, the winner of that competition was worst present from granny ever, because it was the older people who voted Brexit. I wanted to make a suggestion and ask a question, and this is directed at Professor Akeda. My suggestion is that the External Action Service should invite her to every single one of your events from now on, because listening to you talk about the EU has made me proud to be a European. So I think you should, from now on, develop a new career in the service of the European External Action Service. But my question is this. You were very elegant and very favorable and positive about your experience as a negotiator with the EU. But you describe the EU almost as a sort of normative juggernaut. And this is the way, by the way, that people feel in London right now facing Monsieur Barnier. It serves them right, of course. I'm very pleased that they are confronting the Commission juggernaut in this way. But my question is, first of all, I'd like to know more about the debate in Japan. Because, of course, if you are sensitive about your national sovereignty, you might argue that, why is this European Union so arrogantly trying to impose not only an EPA, which obviously has certain conditions, but almost, as you were saying, a gamut of normative priorities, a view of basically how society should be governed and how the economy should be governed and what our attitude should be in a whole array of areas. So I was wondering whether there was any pushback in Japan. Were there political parties or journalists or prominent individuals in Japan who raised questions about this? And secondly, as an expert in negotiations, my second question would be, do you think the EU is actually shooting itself in the foot sometimes by insisting on such a dense normative package? Perhaps we could go easy on some of these normative aspects in the interest of free trade, which is ultimately, and economic growth, which is ultimately what it's all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I don't know if now, would you like to give some answer or any panelists to the 2 questions that we have had now? Maybe Professor Itoh could start, and maybe you afterwards, and if you want to give also.
I will respond to your second questions. Now, when, say, Japan, take the case of Japan-US negotiations. When Japan is negotiation with the United States, say, in the area of deregulation of retail sectors, and the United States is very strong, just open just market for the retail stores. Then if you look at Japan, maybe 20 or 30% of people is just in the side of the United States to believe liberalization is good. And maybe 30% is strongly against the request of the United States, and maybe 40% is just neutral. And if everything is decided in a domestic politics, it is impossible to change status quo. It's very difficult. But that kind of discussion just activate the debate in Japan. And when we just agree, maybe changing to the direction where the United States is requesting, may be good. Now, when the United States is giving us a very, very difficult request, which is not very good for us, simply just neglect. So it's very similar to the case of the EU and Japan. Actually, I was very heavily involved in these private companies of the railway companies. And there's a very strong request from the EU side to nasty, very difficult request for procurement for private company, not government. So what happened is because our government just pushed very strong pressure to the private companies to buy something from Europe for rail. And they try, and this didn't work because the standard is so different. So what happens? They just, throw it away. So I think there's a kind of a digestion process for each side for the process of negotiation. When that's good for them, why not just accept? If not, just calmly, secretly, just try to just forget the issue. And in many areas, I think EU-Japan negotiations, I think the proposal from the United States, Europe, was very good to stimulate the changing the policies in Japan. So I think the opening the debate to the other countries is a very important step towards the activization of the domestic policies.
Maybe somebody want to continue? Would you like to? Yes? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting and very, how to say, exciting comment. And to tell you the truth, I was famous or infamous one of the one or two very minority pro-European negotiator in Japanese government. And because I studied European Union very much, and I understand the decision-making process and how this normative, bias has been produced through the European institution. So I quite understand the EU policy and motivation. But most of Japanese bureaucrats, it's totally difficult to understand. Also, it's kind of create uneasy feeling towards EU. And of course, EU produced a very disastrous situation about the CETA, ratification, and also some, legal opinion about the Singapore FTA ratification. So this, very consistent, norm-oriented EU policy is sometimes very, very harmful for create agreement rapidly. And at the same time, it's ironically, Japanese government agreed to introduce normative chapters because for Japan, it's kind of marginal agenda. Our focus is market access, automobile, and to make concession to produce concession from the European Union, we decided to accept this normative aspect. And for EU, it's so important. But for Japan, we still not so much understand this importance. But as I told before, as a result, and in the long term, this acceptance would change Japanese, mindset and policy. That's my opinion and also my hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you. For the first question, Félix? Yeah. Okay, very good.
About the decision-making process. I have the experience within the European Union. The European Union is improving the decision-making system so that new stakeholders may influence the final outcome. And within the security and cybersecurity fields, for instance, together with, of course, member states, governments, industry, and so forth, the Commission introduced a new ecosystem of non-governmental actors, including technological centers, university experts, private sector, and that influence not only the outcome of the decision-making process, but they influence from the very beginning. For instance, decisions regarding the standards, the certification, the requirements for European cybersecurity, I decided, consulted, and discussed among this ecosystem of private, public actors together with the Commission, so that the final regulations, and directives or initiatives are constructed, implemented, and reviewed together. And this is very important because in these sectors, security and cybersecurity, private actors have the expertise and they lead most of the assets of the policy. For instance, with regard to security, with regard to defense, this ecosystem has defined the requirements, the standards, the technology required for civil protection, borders, safety, and so forth. And they join technological programs of expertise, Horizon 2020, and many others. So in these particular areas, the decision-making is open to this kind of new system. The problem for the high politics on defense or military and forces is that the traditional actors still retain most of the power. And in this case, they, not the European Commission, well, together with the European Commission, they try to present the final outcome as participative, as inclusive as the other ones, and it's not the case, because key decisions are taken by key stakeholders, key influencers, and not by the whole community, because the national parliaments are not involved in hard decision-making on defense. And that is the same for national parliaments and for the European Parliament. So as a result of this, I appreciate a difference between the participation, empowerment of European people with regard to some common policies than to others more restricted to the old thinking. And as a consequence of this, it's going to be very difficult for the European authorities to persuade national populations that all these measures on defense are taken in order to protect them, because they have not been consulting about what is to be protected. So that's the outcome. According to the model you choose, you have a different perception by the society. Thank you.
Very, very simple. I think, well, I do totally agree with Félix Arteaga, but I think there's a difference between referendum and open platforms for the civil society to participate. For example, renowned academic Mary Bird mentioned in the Brexit referendum, she said that only educated would be able to vote, educated civil society. But it's not about education on terms of attainment of education level, but educating on the the outcomes of their decision. So the problem was to give a referendum to people that were not completely informed of what the consequences were to be in or out of the European Union. So referendums are always tricky. You don't know the outcome, and if the validity of it makes your policy completely change. And that was, in this case, a political gamble at the time. So the idea of open platforms like this one that I mentioned, and on the line of Arteaga just quoted, is more about ideas lab. It's more about getting some ideas that would just work out to think out of the box to the people that normally are considered supposedly experts and key persons, key decision makers. So it doesn't mean that they have to follow completely the rules, but they can count on certain expertise from the users and also give them the idea of satisfaction that they are also adding a little bit of value, personal value in that build-up of, in this case, of Europe or another project.
Thank you very much. I think I might take two very quick questions we have there, and I will ask both to be very, very precise, and also the answers so that we can more or less finish in time. Thank you very much. Ambassador Yáñez, I think, was asking.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all panelists. Most interesting discussion. And my questions go a little bit in the same direction as Charles Powell before, but in a different spirit. Mainly to Mrs. Akeda. I was also very struck by your explanation of the negotiations, your experience negotiating with the EU. But I was also very interested by the fact that you mentioned, if I understood you correctly, that Japan is now taking advantage, so to speak, of this experience in also applying these same or similar systems of norms on social and environmental standards or corporate governance or whatever in its negotiations with other countries or groups of countries. So if I understand that correctly, that would be a way to generalize, so to speak, those systems of norms in a wider setting. So if we are in the business of promoting rule-based international order or defending and promoting inclusive and open economic order, so maybe EU and Japan are now partners in promoting those systems of norms. So I'm looking at it from a different angle. So could you comment on that, particularly regarding the initiative by Japan on refloating the TPP even after the United States, we all hope for the time being, has withdrawn from that compact. But now I understand Japan, Australia, and other countries are going ahead with that project. Could you compare that with the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement that has practically been agreed? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yáñez. On that, I think it's a very interesting question. On that, I would like to ask also Professor Itoh, who mentioned, how do you see this combination of, on one side, FTA with the European Union, on the other side, new TPP? Do we have an spaghetti bowl trap? Can we have a spaghetti bowl trap with the center in Japan? Or is it going, as Ambassador Yáñez suggests, is it going to reshape trade dynamics in Asia? So the second question.
Well, no, I mean, Ambassador Yáñez just stole my thunder. I was just actually going to ask about that.
Okay, so everybody had that in mind. Fantastic. Okay, thank you. Well, I have then a second question to Professor Annamaria. Well, we are adapting our societies to this fourth industrial revolution, to robotization, and on the other side, we are seeing this economic model going towards a more differentiated, in terms of income. So how do you see in this model that we are witnessing now, robotization and more social differences? Do you see it sustainable? What is the thinking of this, both in Spain and Japan? Is there any common ground where we can reflect together? Are we going towards a Robocop society? So please, if you could take the questions. Thank you very much. Maybe you can start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very productive comment and question. And my kind of conclusion is I would like to say Japan and EU approach is a kind of converging, but not exactly totally. And I think Japan is equipped by the new social chapters, EU-Japan EPA, and Japan can use these, chapters as kind of cards to play complex EPA games. So still for Japan, it's kind of optional, selective. If it for ongoing or future FTA negotiation, Japan would include these chapters or not, because still Japan approach is functional and also flexible. And sometimes Japan think this normative approach or the social chapter is suitable for other Asian developing countries as a trade partner. So I would like to say is now Japan and EU can use these slightly different approaches complementary and also strategically, sometimes like good cop and bad cop. So EU goes straight forward and force kind of normative, aspect, but Japan is more functional and more accommodate to the Asian, each country's economic situation and political situation. But absolutely, we can cooperate more and coordinate more about including these social chapters.
Thank you very much. Maybe Professor Itoh, if you wanted to.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was in negotiation group for Japan and Singapore EPA about 18 or 19 years ago. That's the first EPA we just had with the other countries. And then we had a Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong of Singapore came to our place and he gave a very interesting lecture. This shouldn't be FTA. This shouldn't be 21st FTA. And what's the difference between FTA and 21st century FTA? Well, just reduction of tariff is only part, and the importance is just including everything. And so Japan called a series of FTA as EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement, which include not only just the border deregulation, but also the environment policy, movement of people, competition policies, dispute settlement mechanism, and intellectual property, and so on and so forth. And I think TPP just had many of this area. If you read the TPP very carefully, you may be impressed how deep and how wide the non-tariff area is discussed. And with or without the United States, the content of TPP is basically the same. And so the same thing for Japan-EU. So Japan-EU negotiation, it was not the first to discuss issue. There's kind of an evolution of that negotiation. And of course, the combination of the Japan and EU just provides some very idiosyncratic natures. Like we have a chapter on geographical identity, GI, which we can't find in other places because we agree that is important, and so on and so forth. So I think when there's going to be some other more negotiation in the future, like RCEP or maybe TPP, including the United States, or maybe some more negotiation, say with the United Kingdom, always I think that kind of non-tariff issue is including. And so I think the FTA, EPA is now very important arena for upgrading our system. And so this is some people call deeper integration. Okay, reduction of tariff is just very, shallow integration. But when the two society is having more interactions, more people is moving from one to the other, more the interaction with the companies, and even just interaction with cultural activities and more philosophical, conversation and so forth. So I think it's very natural to EPA to just include that. But of course, negotiation become more difficult if we try to be ambitious, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe if you want to say a last...
Yes. Well, the short answer to your question might be just there's no solution. If I had it already, that would be incredible. But just the forecast is that in 2019 there will be 2.6 million of industrial robots, and in fact the European Union is the largest, is the region with the largest concentration of these industrial robots. Just only this last year, around 400,000 industrial robots were put in practice, and 40% were done in China, which will be seen as the main market where this will grow. Still, the European Union will grow around, I think, 8%, and Asia, I think, also 16%. I don't have clearly the statistics, but you can probably find them. In the case of Europe, it is important in the process of autonomization. But autonomization is a word that was already used in Japan for a long time, jidoka, and it was kind of created by Toyota in the just-in-time process in the 1960s, and more or less finally pursued by 1980s. So for Japan, industrial robots is one thing that they are used to, and they see the importance of implementing them in the industry to make it more efficient and more productive. And it has proved out right, more or less. So they don't have, let's say, problems with what will happen with the labor market and so on, because they already kind of dealt with this time ago. The other question is about these more sophisticated language learning robots, the Android ones, and what will actually happen with them. And I think these are the ones that they are kind of saying, do we have to give them insurance? Do we have to tax them? Because they are actually taking the position of somebody that will give heart or warmth to a job position, for example, and that's in the debate not only in Japan but also in Europe. In fact, Japanese company that is SoftBank Robotics is working closely with the European Union in regard to this matter. And will they take over our labor? That's the kind of the key question. Well, the only way over it will be just to increase the knowledge economy, to create really a knowledge society that is not only focused on STEM, as many governments are totally focused, but also STEM and humanities, what is the philosophical, ethical, and moral implications of having these new types of more sophisticated robots. And I think that will be a challenge not only for the EU and Japan, but also for, obviously, other economies like the US and China.
Well, thank you very much to all panelists. We are going to wrap up, to close this session. I thank you very much for the wonderful questions we had and for the interesting debate. Thank you very much.